The scream came in on the storm, and I almost shot it. I had the flare gun up before I knew my hand had moved, the barrel level with the dark where the breakwater used to be visible, back before the fog rolled in thick enough to eat the lighthouse beam 10 feet past the glass. Something out there was screaming like a ship's hull tearing open, and in 11 years of graveyard shifts on this rock, I had learned that anything screaming in that fog was screaming because it was dying, and anything dying out there was usually the reason a captain came looking for someone to blame in the morning. I did not fire. I climbed down instead, lantern in one hand, gun in the other, down the spiral stair and out onto the rocks where the waves were still throwing foam halfway up the cliff. She was wedged between two boulders at the high water line, and even broken she was the biggest living thing I had ever stood near. Slate grey scales, storm-ridged along the spine, one wing folded wrong and the other torn through like sailcloth in a gale. Blood ran black in the lantern light from a gash above her brow ridge, and her eyes, both of them, were the milk white of a man dead 3 days. She could not see me. She could only hear me, and she thrashed at the sound of my boots on the stone hard enough to crack one of the boulders clean through. I should have gone back up. Every story on this coast said a dragon found broken was a dragon you let die quiet and far from your door, because the ones that came looking for their own did not stop to ask who'd done the breaking. I set the lantern down instead, where she could feel the warmth of it, and I talked to her the way I talk to gulls with fishing line wound round their legs. Low. Steady. Nothing that sounded like a threat. It took 4 hours to get close enough to touch her. By dawn, the fog hadn't lifted an inch, which should have told me something, because fog that thick doesn't usually survive a sunrise wind off open water. I didn't think about that yet. I was too busy hauling a dying dragon's head into my lap and pouring fish broth past her teeth a spoonful at a time, and feeling her stop thrashing, finally, somewhere around the 3rd hour, when she understood I wasn't going to hurt her and wasn't going to leave. I drag her, there is no other word for what it took, inch by inch, my back screaming louder than she had, into the storm cellar under the lamp room, because it was the only space wide enough and dark enough that she might believe she was hidden. I packed the wing wound with kelp and clean rags. I did not have anything for the eyes. I don't know what you use for a dragon's eyes. I sat with her instead, until the broth was gone and she'd stopped flinching at my breathing, and then I climbed back up to light the lamp for ships that, I would learn later, had already stopped needing it. The fog did not lift the next night either. I logged it the way I logged everything: duration, density, no wind to account for it, and I told myself a storm front was sitting offshore the way they sometimes do, stubborn, refusing to move. I went down to the cellar between log entries and fed her again, and on the second night she let me touch the ridge of her brow without flinching, and on the second night I heard, far out past where the breakwater should have been, something that was not waves. It was a sound like wind moving through 1,000 sheets of canvas at once. I told myself it was the storm. I went up to the lamp room anyway and stood at the glass a long while, watching the iron-grey fog for any shape darker than the rest, and saw nothing, only felt, the way you feel a held breath in a room before anyone speaks, that the coast had stopped being empty. By the 3rd night she could stand. Not far, not steady, but she got her hindquarters under her and pushed up against the cellar wall and made a sound low in her chest that I understood, somehow, the way you understand an animal's pain or its gratitude without either of you needing words. She was asking where she was, and whether it was safe, and I told her the only way I knew how, which was to keep my hand flat and still against her foreleg until the asking stopped. That second night also cost me something I hadn't counted on. A trawler captain named Orville Poyne, the only man on this coast who still spoke to me without that old suspicion curdling his voice, radioed up asking why my supply boat hadn't come for its scheduled run. I'd missed it, 3 days running, too busy hauling broth and kelp down a spiral stair to remember the world above the fog kept its own schedule. I told him weather had me pinned. He went quiet on the line in a way that told me he didn't believe it, and that the quiet would spread, the way quiet always did in their harbour, until it hardened into the same old story about the keeper and what he wasn't saying. I let him go on believing it. There are costs you pay without arguing the price. That was the night the ship stopped answering the wireless. I didn't know it yet. I only knew the fog out past the light had gone the colour of old iron, and that the sound like canvas in the wind was closer, and that something in my chest had gone cold and certain the way it does right before very bad weather, except there was no wind at all to carry bad weather in. I should tell you what the coast believed, because it matters for what came after. For 200 years the fog banks past this light had taken ships, quietly, without wreckage, without bodies, without so much as an SOS crackling through before the silence. And for 200 years the keepers of this light had been the last ones to see those ships' lanterns before they vanished, which made the keepers, in the slow grinding logic of grief, the ones who must have done something, or failed to do something, or known something they weren't telling. My grandfather had kept this light. So had his father. Both of them died with that suspicion still hanging on them like wet wool, unproven and unshakable. I had stopped expecting it to ever be otherwise. On the fourth morning, though morning was only a word now, the fog had gone the same grey at every hour, day bleeding into night without a sunrise to mark the difference. I went down to the cellar and found her standing fully upright for the first time, head nearly brushing the stone ceiling, and she had turned her ruined face toward the cellar door before I'd even reached the bottom step. She'd heard them before I had. It was the canvas sound, and it was not far out anymore. It was past the breakwater. It was coming up the rocks. I climbed back to the lamp room with my heart going like a hammer and looked out into fog that should have shown me nothing, and saw instead, because they were close enough now that even our useless light caught them, 6 shapes coming up out of the water and onto the stone, wings folded tight against bodies built for violence, heads low and swinging the way a hunting animal's head swings when it is reading a scent trail it does not like the end of. I had the flare gun in my hand again. I knew, with the kind of clarity that arrives only once or twice in a life, that it would do nothing at all against what was climbing my rocks, and that going for it anyway was the only thing left that felt like dignity. I went down to the cellar instead. I stood in the doorway, between them and her, with an empty flare gun and 11 years of being blamed for ships I never touched, and I waited. The lead dragon was golden bronze, old enough that the bronze had gone dull at the edges, and when he came through the cellar door he did not look at me first. He looked past me, to where she stood swaying against the stone, and the sound that came out of him was not the canvas-tearing scream I'd heard on the storm. It was small. It cracked in the middle. It was the sound a creature makes when it has spent 4 days believing someone is dead and finds, instead, that they are merely broken. She made the same sound back. Recognition, not relief. They already knew. They had been hunting this coast for her for longer than the 4 days I'd had her, and every ship the fog had ever quietly taken had not been taken by the fog at all. It had been taken by what hunted in the fog, looking for a stolen daughter of their own pack, hunting wide and blind and furious through waters that humans had no business sailing while that hunt was on, and every keeper who'd ever stood accused on this rock had been innocent of everything except living beside a grief too large and too old to explain itself to anyone. The gold bronze elder turned to me then. I do not know what I expected. The stories only ever told you about the kneeling, the whole coast's mythology built on dragons bowing low before some deserving stranger, and some part of me, small, foolish, 11 years tired, braced for it. He didn't kneel. He lowered his head until it was level with mine, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off him, and he held it there, still, the way you hold still for someone you are deciding whether to trust with something irreplaceable. You fed her, he said. It was not a question. His voice was rock grinding on rock, but the words came out careful, like he was handling them with claws too large for the job. She was dying, I said. I wasn't going to let that happen on my watch because of what people might think in the morning. He held the stillness a moment longer. Then he straightened, and the 5 behind him straightened with him, and something in the set of all 6 of them changed from hunting to something gentler, the way a held breath changes when it's finally let go. The fog will lift tonight, he said. Tell your people the lighthouse never failed them. Tell them what failed them was grief, looking in the wrong place, for far too long. I asked him if she would live. He said the eyes would not heal, but the rest of her would, given time and a quieter shore than the one his hunt had turned this coast into. I asked, because 11 years of silence had made me bold in ways I didn't recognize in myself, whether they'd take her now, back to wherever a pack like that called home. He looked at her, swaying but standing, and then at me, and said the daughter would choose where she healed, and that he would not be the one to drag her from a place she'd already decided was safe. She stayed 11 more days. Long enough for the wing to knit closed if not straight, long enough for her to learn the particular weight of my hand on her brow meant nothing was coming for her, long enough that when the 6 of them returned to carry her home, she pressed her ruined face once against my shoulder before she went, and I felt, for the first and only time in 11 years on that rock, entirely undeserving of how gently something so large could be. The fog never came back the way it had been. Ships passed clean now, lanterns visible for miles, and the talk in the harbour town slowly turned from blame to a story nobody quite believed and nobody quite disbelieved either, about a keeper and something enormous he'd hidden in his cellar during the worst week the coast had ever logged. Orvald Poirin was the only one who ever asked me straight out if it was true. I told him the lighthouse had never lost a ship, not once, not in 200 years of being blamed for it, and that he could put that in his next letter to the harbour board if he wanted. because it was the truest thing I'd said to anyone in 11 years. He never asked again. He started waving when his trawler passed the rock instead, which he hadn't done since my grandfather's time, and I understood that for what it was, not an apology, exactly, but the coast finally setting down a weight it had been carrying for 2 centuries by mistake. I went back to climbing the spiral stair every evening at dusk, lighting the lamp the same as my father and his father before him, an old man doing an old job on a rock at the edge of the water, and if anyone asked why I sometimes left a bowl of fish broth cooling by the cellar door on quiet nights, I told them it was for the gulls. It wasn't for the gulls. But some things, I've found, you keep for yourself, and let the dark coast believe whatever story makes it easiest to sleep.